So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And we know some people are still trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started to allow enough time for everybody to, we kind of have a full agenda, but it's also hopefully a really engaging discussion. And yeah, Sam, if you can. We're really excited about this opportunity for a joint Planning Commission, Community Development Committee brown bag. We've been wanting to do this for a while. I think I've been wanting to do this for like a year. And so finally getting organized to at least send an invite out and get everybody invited. We have an exciting topic with the core neighborhood plan. Mark and Aaron from our office are going to kind of kick off into some facilitated discussions. We did allow quite a bit of time, hopefully a good half hour towards the end of the meeting for public engagement and discussion and input, and so you hopefully find that good. We a couple maybe just to kick it off to talk about the core neighborhood plan and what that might mean. And so as you know, we use the term core neighborhood plan. We've been talking about it for a while, and but we imagine that it could have different connotations, meanings, and intentions for any one of us. And so part of the goal of today is to try to develop a consensus, or at least feedback if the staff is heading in the right direction, and to make sure we're heard the discussions over the last several years about this topic, that we're on target. And so we do want, hopefully, an engaging discussion. And Melissa, if you want to join us at the table. So if you're a Community Development Committee member, Planning Commissioner, feel free to join us at the table. And we will be using that microphone over off to the left, that podium, for public comment. And Mark and Aaron will be using this podium off to the right, I believe. And so just one kind of just tidbit of housekeeping. I'll be trying to be a timekeeper a bit, and as well as if we get a little off topic, I might try to steer us back, because we want to talk about ways of moving the needle forward as opposed to some of the things that might not be working today. And we understand there's a lot of concerns and constraints and issues. I've been with the city for 12 years now, and so I hopefully feel like I've been in a 12-year dialogue with our core neighborhoods. And I know many people living in the neighborhoods, et cetera, have been in that dialogue for generations. And so we want to be mindful of that, but also move the needle forward. So if I hear us getting too off topic with some of the goals we're trying to accomplish, I might try to insert myself into that conversation. With that, I'll just want to introduce our Plan Commission Chair, Shara Fisher, and let you take it from here.
Yeah, thank you. For those of you that haven't been to our brown bag before, we do encourage discussion here and sharing of ideas. So just to get us started, why don't we just introduce ourselves so we know kind of what committee we're sitting on and where we're coming from. So Shara Fisher, Chair of the Planning Commission.
Tony Grinberg, City Commission.
Jim Johnson, Community Development Committee.
John Strand, Chair of Community Development.
Melissa Rademacher with the Downtown Community Partnership and Development.
Linda Klebe, Community Development.
Aaron Nelson, City of Fargo Planning Department staff.
Mark Williams, City of Fargo Planning Department.
Miranda Tassa, Planning Commission.
Sammy Eidenschink, Home Builders Association, Community Development Committee.
John Gunkelman, Planning Commission.
Rocky Schneider with the Planning Commission.
Sam McDonald, Community Development Committee.
Thomas Hill with United Way, Cass Clay in the Community Development Committee.
Matthew Pike with Community Development Committee.
Nicole Crutchfield, Planning Department.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Well, why don't we just jump right into it? Mark Williams, you'll take us through some discussion.
Kind of reiterating what Nicole was saying, I appreciate everyone being here today. We're going to try sort of getting an idea of how you feel and what you feel the core neighborhood plan is. So we're going to do a little activity here. And in essence, Aaron's handing out a sheet of paper that has 5 blanks on it. We have a couple questions. If we could spend just 5 minutes, if you could write down up to 5 answers, If you can't get 5, that's all right. But in essence, think about what's the purpose of Core Neighborhood Plan? And what is it, what's the purpose of the plan to you? And what do you want the Core Neighborhood Plan to achieve? So if you could write those down, and we'll give you 5 minutes, and we'll open this back up.
And there's no right or wrong answer.
There is no right or wrong answer.
Excuse me. Is everybody doing homework?
So we're just taking some time. Everybody's writing down their thoughts, so we do questions on the screen. 3 more minutes. Whatever comes to mind.
We got a couple more minutes to wrap up.
Why don't you just take over that lot? You should just take over that lot next to you.
Pretty tough for anybody to build on. And then when I get ready to sell my house, you can sell.
It looks like everyone has finished. This is where this meeting's going to get fun, and might be a little touchy-feely. So remember, there's no wrong answers. In essence, this is an exercise for us to be able to try putting ourselves in your shoes to be able to help us understand a little bit more where you're coming from and where you want this document to go in the future. So in essence, we have Megan up at the podium on the computer, and we're going to kind of go around the room one by one and start going through what you guys have written down as your goals as far as what the plan means to you and what you want the plan to be able to achieve. And I don't think there's any better person to start with than Shara.
Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome.
At its very core, I hope it can define what a core neighborhood is. Just a simple definition of a core neighborhood. We're just going one at a time, right? And then we'll go around. Tony,
Yeah.
go ahead and go.
I think, what I think I'm going to anticipate that we're going to see is a lot of similarities between all our answers, and that's really the goal that we want to achieve. And counterclockwise, Commissioner Grimberg?
Charge is delegated.
He did.
That's a great thing. I have a well-understood and supported plan with objectives for neighborhoods.
Help provide a guide for future decisions that impact the neighborhood.
A core plan should reflect contemporary values-based policy at the city level.
Can you repeat that, Commissioner
A
Stan?
core plan should reflect contemporary values-based policy at the city level.
The plan should include like a timeline with goals and then dates on when you can actually measure your progress.
I'd like to see preserve and enhance the affordability of core neighborhoods, including ownership opportunities.
Well, to restore homes in the neighborhoods and also enhance the neighborhood schools.
Identifies current state and identifies goals of the makeup of the neighborhood.
I guess kind of going on that theme, having a strategic plan that allows the staff to set and achieve goals.
To facilitate growth and still maintain affordability.
I'm going to go to increase communications amongst the core participants and to manage expectations of those participants in the planning process.
To serve as a guidebook and unify activities of the city with a shared vision and goals for the core neighborhoods.
I have to build out a vision for city expansion that preserves, obviously, historic neighborhoods, and it also helps coordinate, or should coordinate, investment from the city through resident input.
So I'm one of those people who writes too much, so I'm going to cut this down slightly just to simply say that I am focused on fostering strong communities with respect to the history and customs within the traditional neighborhoods.
I'll let Megan catch up here a second, but my plan is we're going to keep going around until we run out of points to talk about.
I would also ask if you can correct anything that I don't capture accurately. That would be great. Thank you.
Round two.
Round two. Best practices for infill and development in these neighborhoods.
My remaining four have been covered. Schools, housing, historical integrity of the neighborhoods, roadmap for affordable housing.
Sure. And if your topics are covered, it's okay to skip it, and we'll just keep going around until we're finished. Any additional ones?
Provide a framework that can assist all areas of our community in making decisions that impact the neighborhoods.
The plan should identify and preserve neighborhood flavor and character.
The plan should include density discussions, goals, and concerns.
What was the first part of that, Melissa? I'm sorry.
Include density discussions, goals, and concerns.
I'd like to also see a framework for enhanced neighborhood identity through activation of residents associations.
Mine are covered.
I don't know how to put this, but sitting on the planning commission, we struggle with projects that, whether it's the Newman Center or whatever, so I'm trying to figure out how to put that into a statement that would assist us. I mean, again, if there's a plan that we finally know how to implement it, it would sure assist us in making decisions when it comes to, you know, when people are coming in for changing zoning or changing, putting a PUD on it or whatever.
Having been concerned about these issues of the core neighborhoods for some time, we established the core, the Fargo Neighborhood Coalition, which has been meeting for about 3 years now. And we're specifically concerned about the core neighborhoods, but all of the neighborhoods. We'd also like to see more neighborhood associations. One of the problems for the Planning Commission and the City Commission both are how to make decisions without stronger guidelines for the planning department. Even developers have spoken to us about not knowing when they're going into projects whether it's going to be a success for them or whether somewhere along the line they're going to fall through, you know, a problem. And so for the entire community, including developers and everyone else, we'd like to see core neighborhood plan developed that would, the 3 priorities have been stability for the neighborhoods, predictability, and sustainability. We've had a task force working on this for quite a while, and I do have a little handout here from the Neighborhood Coalition as to who's on the task force and what we've accomplished so far. We have a lot of other talking points that we've come to, but we just decided to keep it simple today, and so I'd like to pass this out if that's okay with you.
Can we wait until towards the end of the meeting to do that? And we'll still keep going around the room to get the input on what people feel the core neighborhood plan means to them and should include.
Good idea.
I'd like to identify incentives that help promote the conversion of single-family homes back, or from rental homes back into single-family homes. You said diversion, which I caught pretty quick. It's conversion. I deal a lot with core plans, but it's usually different.
I think I just want to reiterate, I think any core neighborhood plan needs to involve input from the residents. And that's should be taken very seriously. And the other thing I guess I haven't maybe heard explicitly stated is core plans should hopefully achieve improved livability that would include parks, recreation, walkability. So not just the housing, but what makes people want to live in a specific neighborhood.
So we could just hit on exactly what I would have said as well, and so I really appreciate what he said it better than I could have. But coordinating the city's overall development goals through resident input to meet the citizens' needs seems to be that coordination seems to be critical.
I'll pass.
Core neighborhood plan should address density and parking. You mentioned density already, but we should address density in light of evolving policies that step up how many people are in the neighborhood. So we need to find a balance between density and parking and growth. Maybe already been said, but.
I mean, just a small addition to that is safety, just making sure they're safe and we're covered and our children are happy and safe and protected.
It's become apparent through some of the discussions that we've had that part of the problem with this is that we need to see the vision of what different zoning will affect some of the different corridors. So the development changes that are being asked for with the zoning changes, people just don't know what it's supposed to look like. But a natural development of the city is to redevelop, and we need to somehow communicate that this is normal development of a city, and let people plan for their changes in their neighborhood.
One more, I know we have a lot of smart, creative people here, but I'm hoping we can identify some new big ideas that we don't have yet, so that we can, for maybe a long-term planning that we're not aware of.
I'd only say that if you want to move on to the achievements section, the only part that I noted in terms of achievements, unless you want to wait.
I would say we can talk about both of them because they're kind of all going to be consolidated. So yeah, we could certainly, if there's additional achievements on your list or additional comments.
Yeah, I only had one, which was to focus on preserving existing neighborhoods, and I appreciate Commissioner Strand's discussion about those traditions and the history, but preserving those existing neighborhoods while also focusing on creating new vibrant communities as well, because preserving that history and the traditions is incredibly important, but understanding that the city moves forward in a way that creating new vibrant communities is something that should also be focused on, because otherwise we simply create places where people can live without real vibrant opportunities to thrive.
I think a core neighborhood plan should have a degree of flexibility and inflexibility. I don't think these plans should be designed to be so easily changed and on a piecemeal fashion, moment by moment, turned upside down.
Perfect. Any more?
Yeah, the back of my page is nothing.
I really appreciate this opportunity to be able to hear all the feedback here. I'm going to kind of let the cat out of the bag a little bit. You know, when the staff met, we kind of came into a room a couple months ago and looked at each other, not really understanding what a core neighborhood plan was, because everyone has so many different definitions. And we went through this process too, and we had an opportunity to be really able to define what we wanted to achieve within the planning department with the core neighborhood plan. I certainly don't want to put words into anyone's mouth, but one thing I didn't see up there, and I'm curious as if we would agree or not agree on this, but one thing that staff also identified is the plan should identify areas of preservation as well as identifying areas that have great opportunities for infill. Is that something that maybe we could agree on as a group? I know when you start looking at the boundaries of the core neighborhood plan, but we will get to the map here in a little bit, there are some great opportunities within the city of Fargo of areas that have been developed a long time ago in the industrial type fashion that might provide opportunities. So the other thing is as we go through this RFP process, we're going to be using this language that you guys came up with to be able to write our RFP, to be able to define a little bit better to the consultants and what we're looking for in this plan and what we want this plan to achieve for us. So we have a little bit narrower, detailed scope. I think all the topics are pretty broad. I do see some main themes with everyone's input here. So I think we'll take this back and try condensing it a little bit more, and we'll probably end up representing that in the future. That being said, I think this was extremely successful, and I think we'll move on to the next portion of our agenda.
And then maybe while Aaron's coming up for, I think, are there going to be handouts for the people in the audience to be able to fill out comments and bring that forward as well to
Yes. Aaron's going to work on a presentation right now, sort of the project summary and some of the direction that we want to go with, including some timelines. But then we're going to have an opportunity for public comment. Any public comment should be on this podium, and in addition, we do have handouts in the back to write down comments for the public that we will process also.
All right, so I'm gonna kind of go through a quick presentation here, try and keep it around 15 minutes. What's being passed out in front of you right now is just basically a project summary. And what this is really just staff's first blush at putting pen to paper with some of our thoughts and ideas and starting to try and get it organized around this idea of a core neighborhoods plan. And so before I kind of dive in, please don't feel like you need to read through it all right now. This presentation will hit the main bullet points here, and then certainly feel free to take that with you and reflect on it. And in the future too, I know as you have additional thoughts, we'll have a lot of discussion here today. But please feel free to reach out to us in the future if you have additional thoughts or something you didn't think of necessarily here today. So before I dive in, just some things to keep in mind. First, this is just a working draft. Our intention, like Mark mentioned, is to take what we hear today, back to the offices and integrate all the comments and feedback that we receive into this project summary. And then ultimately, that third bullet point there, as Mark kind of mentioned already as well, the project summary will inform the drafting of a request for proposals, or RFP. So I think as we've talked about previously in previous meetings and things, we'll be looking to bring a consultant on board to help lead this process. And that process starts with the request for proposals. And so, the intention here is to get started on the right foot in the right direction. It's really meant to be a communication tool, making sure we're kind of all on the same page, general agreement, as far as getting this on the right trajectory. So with that, I'll kind of dive right in, starting with the study area. The core neighborhoods plan, when you say that, people maybe think of, have different ideas in their minds about what is a core neighborhood. And so from staff's perspective, when we talk about core neighborhoods, we generally talk about it as being bounded by 19th Avenue north on the north side, 25th Street on the west, including the Madison neighborhood extending out to 35th Street there on the west, I-94 on the south side, and then the Red River on the east side, excluding the downtown core, which obviously was just recently studied with the Downtown in Focus plan. And so we really kind of think of this as kind of an extension or the next step after the Downtown in Focus plan recently was completed. Now these boundaries, I would say, aren't really set in stone, meant to be kind of more general, but this is just to kind of give everybody an idea of what our thoughts are. Next, we've tried to just outline or kind of identify some of the primary or main issues that we've heard from staff's perspective over the years. Things like property maintenance and neighborhood character, code enforcement and blight, infill and redevelopment pressures, maybe related to population growth, affordable housing, lack of diverse housing options, school enrollment, as that relates to the core neighborhoods, the declining enrollment or lack of the enrollment of previous years. Aging infrastructure, obviously this area has some of the older infrastructure related to the overall city. And then competing goals, and what this means, at least from where staff is we've got a number of goals that you see in some of these planning commission cases that were discussed here just recently. Things like balancing historic preservation or preservation of existing housing with infill. We've got two goals that are kind of complicate each other and kind of need to balance those. And then there's other things like the livability issues, which I think was also mentioned here. Some of these things aren't necessarily issues today, but might be things that are worth looking into as part of this for improvement. Next, I wanted to talk. We're going to talk about the project outcomes. So you can really just think of these as, how do we define what do we hope to get out of this, and what would result in a successful project? So just going through these one by one, the first thing we came up with was a collective and broadly supported future vision and plan for the core neighborhoods. I think we heard this comment in our facilitated discussion today as well. We're making sure that as best as we can, try and get some consensus about the direction that we'd want to see core neighborhoods heading in the future. Next, we'd be looking for a clear understanding of the various issues affecting core neighborhoods. So not just identifying these issues, but understanding them at a deeper level to help inform, potential solutions and policy discussions that might need to be had in the future. Next, improve trust and understanding between and among stakeholders. I think we've seen this all with some of the contentious zoning cases that we've seen in recent years. Hopefully this process can, there can be kind of maybe an educational component, so all involved can have a better understanding of everybody's points of view, where they're coming from, things like that. Fourth, framework for which future planning efforts can build upon. Here, I think we have a general understanding that this planning process isn't going to solve all of our problems overnight. But our hope is that it can at least provide a framework or a foundation on which we can build in the future if we ever wanted to dig into things like special topics or maybe small areas or individual neighborhoods, wherever those needs happen to arise in the future, having that good base foundation from which to work. Next, clearly defined implementation actions and recommendations. I think anybody could probably tell you the hardest part about any plan is the implementation process. And so I think the hope here is that we can have when we're kind of in the thick of things with the consultant throughout this process, have a clear set of what's expected once the consultant leaves town. How do we keep that momentum going and kind of put some of these things into action? And then lastly, stakeholders and city decision makers having relevant data, information, and policy guidance to inform future decision making. The hope here is that this can be an applicable tool to be used when it comes to day-to-day decisions or as things crop up or arise within the core neighborhoods. So the last thing that we wanted to touch on was just the scope of work elements. As I mentioned, the kind of the purpose of this project summary is to inform the drafting of the RFP. And the scope of work elements are things I think that we'd want to include in that RFP that, or the consultant will be expected to propose kind of a plan of action or a plan of attack, how they foresee their process for helping us achieve our ideal project outcomes and visions for this process. And so the idea with the scope of work elements is we probably want to provide them with kind of some of our expectations as a city of what do we expect or what are our general expectations for how things that should be included in the process. And so this is really just a quick list of things that we'd want them to touch on as part of their overall scope of work and approach to the project. So just I'll run through these each really quickly. First is just general project management. Here it's just the consultant is expected to be in close communication with the city throughout the project life cycle here. We're not just going to cut them loose and let them come back with a finished document at the end. It's going to be a very collaborative approach. However, the consultant will be responsible for managing their own time, their own staff, their own resources, budget, etc. Staff's role in all of this would be to provide general oversight for the consultant and then to facilitate interactions with city staff, boards, committees, and different project stakeholders. So really providing kind of the facilitation to help the consultant do their best work, especially when they're in town and setting up those meetings and different things like that. Next, public and stakeholder participation. This is probably one of, if not the most important element that we want to see in this document, or in the proposals that come in. Here, the consultant would be expected to propose a comprehensive public and stakeholder participation strategy. Staff anticipates there being the need for some type of a steering committee to help with the decision-making process throughout the study. And then here broad stakeholder and support and consensus are paramount to the success of this planning effort. And I think we kind of heard some of that here as well. Existing conditions and data analysis. You can kind of think of this as the discovery phase. This is pretty typical to any planning process. It's really the getting an understanding of the context, trends, and related information applicable to the core neighborhoods. The information and data would be used to inform the study and then to ground the study in objectivity. So here it's just you're getting up to speed, making sure we have a firm understanding about of the situation, and then taking this as well as the public participation piece, bringing those two things together to really understand the existing conditions and kind of where to go from here. Vision and goal setting would probably need to be part of this process as well. The development of a broadly supported and achievable vision and related goals to the core neighborhoods. Here again, trying to get a firm understanding of where we're all headed and make sure we're all in agreement with that. This would probably build upon the GO 2030 comprehensive plan and related policies with the understanding that GO 2030 is the city's comprehensive plan, really sets the broad vision for the city as a whole, but we'd probably want to identify what does that look like at the neighborhood level. How do these big visions, big goals, what does that look like in the neighborhood on the ground? 5, identification of focus areas. So there probably need to be a process where we would, for right-sizing the study. And what that kind of relates to is what are the topics. We've heard a lot of topics here this morning in our discussion so far. We don't want the study to be too broad, look at too many topics, resulting in a lack of depth. And at the same time, we don't want it to be too focused on too limited, scope where, results in a number of unaddressed issues. And so what's the right size for the study? Recognizing there's a limited amount of time and resources in which to work. And so how do we prioritize, the things to look at? We may want to specify topics which must be included, make that known from the start, and then also leave some flexibility for topics to be identified as part of the preliminary or the first phases of the planning process. There might be some topics that we're not thinking of today that come up as a result of some of the stakeholder outreach, things like that. So there's some examples listed there. I don't need to go through right now. Next, there's probably going to need to be policy development and analysis. We're looking probably for the consultant to propose or let us know how they intend to generate and refine potential solutions and strategies for achieving study goals and project objectives. This might be an iterative process that involves some stakeholder input, things like that. How do we make sure we're getting ending up with the best strategies for addressing some of the issues that are identified as part of this process. And then plan development, this is really just the organization and documentation of the planning process. While we're doing this, at the end of this process, we'll want to make sure that we've encapsulated all the good work that hopefully has been done, and have that in a document that is usable, however that might look. Historically or typically, that might be a final planning document, but there might be some alternatives out there, other media that can help with the communication process at the end of this that might be worth looking at as well. I think from staff's perspective, we're looking at it to at least include an executive summary or some type of overview of the process, and then detailed implementation strategy. But everything in between, it can probably be left to the consultant to propose something that based on their expertise. 8, implementation strategy. Again, the implementation is always the hardest part, and so we'd be looking at for the consultant to put their best foot forward with proposing how they think that this can be the most successful when it comes to implementation. I think we'd be looking for something innovative and proactive as far as an approach to the implementation to ensure the highest chances for success. And lastly, presentation and communications. This kind of relates back to the stakeholder participation, but the consultant would be responsible for some of the communication with project stakeholders throughout the planning process. I think we want this to be a very transparent process, and then anybody that is interested in participating or at least knows what's going on throughout the process. Some planning efforts that might be, a project website or, some other communication strategies that keep everybody abreast of what's going on. There's also probably be some presentation of maybe some intermediate deliverables that are identified as part of the project scope once that's created, and then related information at key points throughout the process, and then some final presentation with maybe the final deliverables to the applicable boards and committees. And so with that, I think the last thing I have for you here today is just kind of some preliminary schedule as we see some of these next steps after today's meeting. Again, kind of one of the primary purposes of today's meeting is to hear from you guys on kind of what your thoughts are, give you an understanding of kind of staff's perspective, and then hopefully hear from the public, and then maybe end with some general discussion on kind of everything that was discussed today. Take that all back, and then start drafting an RFP over the next month and a half. Our goal would be to have an RFP done sometime in June, end of June, maybe hopefully earlier if we can. Looking for to have that advertised for a little over a month with proposals from consultants being due by August 5th. From there, we'd select maybe a handful that are worth interviewing, get them scheduled, lined up for interviews. Probably have some type of selection committee sometime in September to select the consultant that best meets our needs. Ideally, we'd have a contract negotiated and on the agenda for a city commission sometime maybe October 21st. And then from there, just really getting the project kicked off. We kind of anticipate about a year-long process. Sometimes these take a little longer depending upon that final scope of work. So that's just kind of a broad overview of kind of how we see this moving forward. So that's really all I have. I'd be happy to kind of go back to any slides or answer any questions you have from our perspective. And I think we've got a lot of time for general discussion as well. So.
Just a comment or question, maybe more to Nicole. We're going to be going through a similar process with the Land Development Code revisions. Will that intersect with the core neighborhood plan in some form or fashion?
Yeah, I imagine there will be some intersection as the two end products will need to reflect each other's outcomes, right? Similar to, I would say, probably a more degree here than we had a similar with the public art master plan and the downtown in focus plan, where we required those consultants to work together and communicate with each other and use staff as a liaison. But this even more so will need to talk to each other, because especially if they're talking about things like code changes or resulting implementation steps, they're going to need to talk to each other.
The question I'll pose to the group and to chew on, and as this is unfolding, I'm not so sure I'm on the same page all the time. I think what we're maybe creating is a neighborhood plan. If we limit a core neighborhood plan just to the old established neighborhoods, I'm concerned about the translation to the other evolving newer neighborhoods, and I would hope our policies will, across the board, affect all neighborhoods. So that issue's got me spinning a little bit. Do we limit ourselves to just the old core neighborhoods? Because I'm not sure I'm there. And I'd be curious what you all think of that.
Well, I think two general responses. One is a little bit of how we got here. And this is probably a good background, a little bit of, why we're working on this to begin with, is maybe about 4 years ago, 4 years ago, we started the Land Development Code task force. We had a resident, I'm looking at Rocky Schneider because he was part of the Planning Commission at that time, but we had John Gunkelman, but we had the Residential Land Development Code task force and the Commercial Land Development Code task force. And both issues pointed to where we're at now with the Land Development Code diagnostics or audit. But the other component is our growth plan of 2007 is what we have in our, to guide future growth and neighborhood work as well. Our growth plan talks about ideal livability and neighborhood. We also have our Go 2030. But what we're missing probably most in a tool is a future land use plan for our core neighborhoods. These are the areas that we see at the city that are most volatile to change. And so as we try to mitigate and manage predictability, forces of change, we don't have any answers. And we can't really we can point to our Go 2030 as some really high level guiding principles, but as a decision tool, we're finding that shortfall. When we look at the area south of town, I would say south of 32nd Avenue, we have our growth plan 2007 growth plan to point to directions and resolution to those. So we have a gap. I would say on the tails of this, where I see the next gap being is, I would say, in the ring between the core neighborhoods area and 32nd Avenue South and up north. So we do have a surrounding area that's going to be left unanswered. But if we were to tackle that all at once, I think we would quickly become overwhelmed. And going back to that right size fit, we're going to find, I think, the influencing factors of change are very different south of the interstate than they are north of the interstate. And so that's our primary goal. It's going to be a really unique product that we've never seen before at the City of Fargo, if that answers some of your concerns.
Just so we don't have real hiccups later with other neighborhoods relative to the core neighborhood, I hope they mirror each other as much as possible.
Yeah, I think we're going to learn a lot from this process, as well as some other, as we look at those implementation tools, I do believe there's going to be some transferable tools. And we do have to recognize we do have existing neighborhood plans for these core neighborhoods that were drafted in the 90s and 2000s that were in response to community development block grant funds and things, but they were missing a land use component. And so that visioning document as it relates to that land use component is really that missing tool, and that's where all of our applications are right now. We're not seeing a plethora of applications south of the interstate or in our kind of ring, but we know forecasting that's going to be a ring of needs to address. Any other questions?
Aki?
Yeah, I guess, Commissioner Strand, I guess my thought on this process is the biggest challenges we have is when somebody comes in with a zoning change from one zoning to another. In the new areas, when it's ag to something, it's a somewhat easier decision on what to do because it's a blank slate. But right now, we're hoping we'll make the best decisions we have with the guiding documents we have. But when a lot of these areas we don't have guiding documents, or they're out of date in some regard. And so I hope this gives us a better, for instance, the Newman Center, they sort of just swore they wouldn't go further east, to the next block, but there's nothing necessarily guiding that one way or another. And so if this, to get to Mark's comments, identifies areas where that's proper and where it's maybe not proper to, look at infill developments, and where it's not, kind of redefine those terms so that we have guiding documents. And I think that's probably going to be true, north of 19th Avenue in that outer ring, or just north or south of the interstate, at the next ring at some point. But we don't see zoning changes requests in those areas right now. And so it's not really a challenge, but probably will be some point.
I think I don't want to cut this part of the discussion short, but we do want to allow time for public dialogue, and then also, Dawn, this might be a good time to introduce the neighborhood coalition's responses to and preparation and materials you've prepared.
Okay, just to say that this is a really simple document. It's just an introductory statement, pretty much. I can pass these around. Is that a good way to do it?
Sure.
Okay. And I think we do have some members of the task force in the audience here that might want to say a word or two.
Is that, while that's being handed out, is there any other comments or questions from the sitting board members?
I have a question for us to ponder, and I'm looking at timing and flow of discussion, but everybody hearing and getting involved in neighborhood discussions is aware of issues of infill, density, and parking, and so on. One of the trends across the country with 806 cities out there have adopted what they call inclusionary zoning. And inclusionary zoning, in a nutshell, is where you loosen up your zoning to allow higher densities in your older core established neighborhoods. So this is a real big trend addressing the questions and the concerns of affordable housing especially, and old neighborhoods. So my thinking is, and we have through the City Commission advanced and passed a motion for us to start studying the topic of inclusionary zoning, but I sure wouldn't I don't think it would be prudent to have that follow this if there are elements of that discussion that would really impact hugely what we mean by core neighborhoods even a year or so from now. For example, with those inclusionary zonings, like Minneapolis is a good close example, you can take an old established neighborhood with small lots and allow people to add accessory dwelling units and turn their house into a duplex, triplex, or fourplex. And that affects density and parking. So this is what's happening across the country, and this topic will come here home to roost. So however, as staff and all of us look at core neighborhoods, I sure hope we weigh that proactively and don't after the fact go, well, gosh, we should have implemented that or had that discussion to affect this earlier.
Maybe, and I'm not sure if there's a question in there, but maybe in response to that, and this is where I cautiously advise that we don't know the solutions yet, because we're still trying to identify the problems. We have an inkling, because we've been in this long dialogue, for me for 12 years, many others for many longer, we have an inkling of what the solutions are. And that's where it's going to be really beneficial with our consultant to have these dialogues with them, and and maybe just as a preface, there has been discussion, why can't we just draft this in-house since we know what the issues are? One of the benefits that I see bringing in a consultant is, kind of a fresh set of eyes, fresh conversation, fresh set of eyes, kind of removing maybe some biases or some blinders. But at the same time, there's that truth vetting and confirmation that those that are close to the problems are going to need to know and have that buy-in. So it's a hopefully get to some win-win solutions. But absolutely, I think, and again, I'm just going to point to the results of that Land Development Code task force, the residential task force in particular. There was 4 kind of short-range, mid-range, and long-range goals established. That mid-range and long-range goals included Land Development Code rewrites to include higher density granny flats or tiny homes or whatever those trends are, because we recognize maybe 2 things that we know for sure. We know we're a growing community. We know we're increasing in demographics and counts. So whether they go south of town or in town, in greenfield or infill, those are all part of the dialogue. And even though we're calling this a core neighborhood plan, that has to be engaged in our visioning process.
Just a comment, I would agree. I think for us to be successful, it's going to have to be bottoms up. To your point about solutions, John and I have responsibility at the City Commission to approve, but from my viewpoint, we need a bottom-up approach to get to where we get to approval process. Because if it's top-down, we're not going to have a successful outcome. And so, just how I was listening to you, it's, many of the folks sitting in this room outside of the Planning Commission or Community Development or the City Commission, they're the ones that are going to be the key to this success, because from a bottoms-up perspective and feedback, and how do we draw consensus, long-term with that effort.
So I do want to make sure we have enough time to talk. We're scheduled to end at 1. And we're trying our new technology of putting Don's letter on the screen. And I don't know if it's working yet or not, or maybe not. Yeah. So we got to ask over to Brian. But meanwhile, while we're waiting on, oh, here we go. this is the first time we're using this. And I don't know how we zoom in. Look at that.
Should I open it up for public comment?
Yeah, so while this is up, I guess we don't have a really set plan. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, and we would invite you. I know this seems like an intimidating format, but it's our intention not for it to be intimidating at all. And so, and really the only way to have that discussion is to bring you to the microphone. So does anybody from the public want to ask anything or express anything?
I think this is on. Hi, I'm Jim Laskowicz. I'm with the Roosevelt neighborhood, but I also am a board member on the Fargo Neighborhood Coalition. And so we view ourselves as a key stakeholder in this process, and we represent Fargo's core neighborhoods. So we're excited to be here. We're really excited for this process. We've been waiting a really long time for this to happen, and so I can't commend you guys enough for kicking this off, and we want to be a voice in this process. And I think what Don brought to today is some of the work that we've been on for the last 2 months or so, which is a task force to assist with this process and these group of meetings. And essentially, I think what we wanted to reinforce, and I'm sure Don will do that too, is that the outcome of this project will be judged really by how well it addresses those 3 things up on the board, which is the stability for our neighborhoods, the predictability for our neighborhoods, and then the sustainability for our neighborhoods. And we boiled that down to its simplest form because we feel that's a message that we can all agree on. And I really appreciate your work and your ability to let us be involved in this process. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Joe Burgum. Have participated with the Fargo Neighborhood Coalition. I also am the president of the Hawthorne Neighborhood Association, but beyond that, I'm just an engaged citizen that loves urban design. So as I think about the slides, and I thank staff for being so thoughtful in terms of opening up this discussion before an RFP even goes out. So really great to be engaged in the process. I think one of the things in terms of the scope, and appreciate all of the additional topics that came up, I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting to think about is mobility and the future of mobility. When we talk about increased density in core neighborhoods within that area that's shared, there are a lot of jobs in that area. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of trips generated, but thinking about how we might create a space for flexibility as the future of mobility evolves. Another thing that was great to see is the economic component. I think when we think about these core neighborhoods, it is an interdisciplinary component, both in terms of the effects it has on the community, housing, transportation, and the tax base. So it'd be great to see some element of that in terms of when we talk about wanting more infill, what does that mean from an economic standpoint in terms of the burden or the benefit to the existing infrastructure? I know there's a lot of scope within that, but just something to think about perhaps. And then I think the last thing that I think would be really exciting to see, and definitely more internal from City Hall, and I think the In Focus plan definitely had this as an interdisciplinary approach coming out of the planning department and across departments, and that Public Works and engineering and these other groups are stakeholders at the table. Because we talk about these things, we can't talk about land use without talking about the road in front of the house. And there are obviously different responsibilities within different departments to create those roads or maintain them. And kind of along that lines, it'd be interesting to think about a corridor approach. You know, we talk about these core neighborhoods really based on school districts as primarily kind of the boundaries around them. But even within them, we have these major corridors. As we've looked to other cities, kind of that visioning about what do we want these streets to be? You know, what is South University 25 years from now? What is 25th Street 25 years from now? And how do we really design around a corridor? So the future of the street, but the future of the land use, and finding those examples. And I think that can provide more identity to some of those neighborhoods on top of not arbitrary boundaries, but those streets, those major streets, are really what kind of define areas. So just some food for thought as we go into this process, and thanks for the time.
Hi, I'm Carol Pearson from the Oak Grove neighborhood, and these are not polished thoughts, but a couple of comments that I thought I would like to see some emphasis on a person hired that would have considerable training in historic architecture that would serve as a resource for, maintaining the historic styles and the renovation of historic neighborhoods. And so I think asking for something that has a very trained person in that thread of architecture and historic neighborhoods is important to me. It's more of a perspective, I think, but having the city serve as a resource for neighborhood agency and neighborhood projects. For example, we're trying to work on this historic overlay development. And so having the city provide, resources for agency on the part of the neighborhood actions is a kind of a perspective I'd like to have considered. Thanks. And thank you for the opportunity to give input.
Hi, my name is Carol Schlossman. I'm with the Downtown Neighborhood Association. The one aspect of implementation that is incredibly difficult is accountability and how that framework looks. And so as part of this plan, I would suggest that that is included in your planning, is how over time those accountabilities line up across the different departments within the city and with the commission and with the different committees. It's often overlooked, and that's where the rubber hits the road.
Harold Thompson with the Roosevelt Neighborhood Association. In the comments, you had indicated one of the points of participation of the neighborhoods with the consultant, and we're really looking forward to that participation. And so I wrote down a couple notes as to I thought would be important items relative to our consultant, besides the obvious experience in the planning process. It's terribly important to me that the consultant becomes an expert in advising us on growth issues. The consultant really needs to understand growth and growth issues related to it. And when it comes to working with our neighborhood associations, I think our consultant should have a very positive rapport in their experience with citizen groups from all walks of life. I think the consultant needs to be sensitive to our culture and our climate. We have boulevards in our neighborhood to hold snow, and a lot of people don't understand that, but that's what they're there for. They also help to green up our neighborhoods, but not all consultants have been sensitive to our culture or our climate. Our consultant then also needs to be obviously very creative, and I call him a creative realist, or her. And then, of course, what Joe had mentioned, experience with interdisciplinary solutions. I can't agree more in that it's just not an issue of all the issues that are on the board, but Public Works and Engineering have, in our most recent past, have been major stakeholders in the planning of our ring neighborhoods, and we want to be sure that they're included, and the consultant understands and expects their advice too. Thank you.
Does that spur any dialogue, or, and I'm not sure if that's complete, but, by all means, if anybody else has anything to come forward with, please feel free to, yeah.
I have a question. Some of the folks in this room have approached us and asked us for something akin to a moratorium on some activities in their neighborhoods until our neighborhood plans are in place. I'm curious how you all feel about that.
As I only have one more meeting as the chair of the Planning Commission, so just my thoughts on that. I don't want us to think that this plan is going to outline every detail to make it a check the box. This development comes in, it checks 8 of the 8 boxes, we're going to do it. I don't think it's meant to be something like that. I think it's meant to be a document that can grow with us and help us reflect, and yes, help us make decisions, but I caution that we put too much pressure on a document to answer all of our questions. I know that would be hard for us as commissioners. That put us in a bit of a position, I would think.
Also, thinking, of course, that it should be a guideline for decisions being made. John's reference to a moratorium, I think, was primarily focused on zoning changes. I don't know if that's the case, but it seems like zoning changes are one of the biggest problems. And so there has been a suggestion that there be a moratorium on zoning changes for big projects in particular. Is that right, John?
Well, I'm listening.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I think that was the suggestion previously that you made reference to.
And I think your point is valid, and as far as us trying to honor the wishes of the neighborhood while we're still moving forward. And I'm not sure a moratorium should be etched in stone, but I think the spirit of the intention should be as much as possible honored, especially if we're finding a balance with policy that we're not sure where we'll land. So that was just a question to pose to the group. Another question I'll pose to the group is relative to neighborhoods. We may at some point get into topics relative to incentives and tax breaks that affect neighborhoods. So I'm not sure how that'll all land, but there are some policies and practices that have a direct impact on neighborhoods, and we may just keep our minds open to that as we move forward, especially with regard to apartments and housing and so on, because those things will come into our radar, I'm assuming.
I keep coming back to this comment that Linda had made about the natural development of a city. I don't know if those are the exact words, but I think as planning commissioners, we look at new growth to the south and infill, and it's sometimes hard to look at one right after the other because it is a different mindset. But the more we discuss that, what is a natural progression of a city? I think that's helpful information.
During the discovery process with the consultants, these potential consultants, who determines who they meet with to make sure that we're checking off all the boxes, like the school board and the art coalition or the art partnership and these neighborhood coalitions? Who decides who these consultants meet with and collect data?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Mostly, it's a discussion with the steering committee and staff and the consultant. And so staff probably spends, if I use the Downtown in Focus or Go 2030 as an example, staff will probably spend a quarter to half of their time, in their 8 to 5, kind of 40-hour-a-week time, interacting with the consulting and guiding them and making those introductions and accessing those invitations and things. And so partly that's on staff to make sure those are well covered, and then the steering committee as well. So again, in both Go 2030 and the Downtown in Focus plan, there's probably 2 types of committees. There's I would say a technical committee that gets into, that's both in-house in the city of Fargo, like across departments, as well as, those that do want to get into the nitty-gritty details of things. But then there's a steering committee with our partners in the community and peer agencies, et cetera, to make sure they have buy-in as well. And so, like on the Downtown in Focus and Go 2030, part of the job, and we'll want to incorporate this probably more explicitly in the resulting contract, is that outreach and presentations. Really, that last step of presentations to these peer agencies. It's often really helpful if the consultant takes some of that lead, because at that point in the process, you've gotten a relationship with those consultants as well. And so sometimes they're at that last step of being that message delivery, they do it best by the end, so.
Yeah, and to add to that a little bit, I don't think any consultant wants to go to the last final commission meeting, asking for a vote on the final plan and have someone stand up and say, whoa, you never talked to us. However, we might be jumping the gun a little bit. As we put the RFP together and start going through the selection process, I think that would be an excellent question to be able to interview the consultant, to be able to ask them, all right, what's your anticipated consensus building, and how do you plan on reaching out to the community and to the different organizations to be able to get their input on this task that you would like to achieve?
One of my notes here is that the Fargo Neighborhood Coalition have maybe some representation on that selection committee.
Yeah, I think probably what we'll do, we'll want to coordinate with our commissioners and mayor and city administrator, of course. But I'm leaning towards a process we use for Downtown in Focus. I'm looking at Joe and a couple of members from the audience that participated in this, where that interview process was public. And so we had a selection committee of 3 or 4 people, but then but the actual, kind of the presentations and that interview process the public was invited as part of that. And so typically that selection committee was very interested in what members in the audience thought along the way. It can be a pretty grueling 2-day process of back-to-back meetings. And so recognizing that whoever does sit on that selection committee will have to have that time dedicated.
Nicole, something else that's occurring to me, especially as we're beginning this process, is we have kind of like a teeter-totter. We have Planning Commission over here, and we have the Community Development Commission over here. And they really aren't the same beasts. They aren't the same entities. They both have real different missions. So yes, so the Planning Commission will deal with planning and zoning, which really isn't the focus of the Community Development Committee. So I think the more we kind of keep us all aiming toward what we have in common and us learning from each other, I like the idea of this joint meeting. I think we should do more of it, especially as this process is going forward, so we all get a sense of each other, because we really have different jobs at our own respective tables that we do. And I'm not, as a planning community development person, I'm not as attuned at all to zoning issues. At all. So we're kind of, the more we can educate each other and bring us all up to speed and help us all get toward that common center with those different viewpoints, because they really are different.
Well, we can certainly end early if someone wants 10 minutes back on their calendar. But any last calls or questions or thoughts? This has all been extremely helpful. We
Nicole?
hope people like the process. Yeah, Rocky.
I have a question for the Neighborhood Coalition, I guess. I noticed the Horace Mann and Madison aren't on your list here. There's no representatives from that. Are they both involved?
We would certainly like them to be. We've been reaching out, trying to find someone that would be a representative from those 2 neighborhoods and would like to incorporate them.
And Washington? Oh, yeah. There you go. That's why I'm heading to the mic.
That was one of my thoughts. I'm Luke Champa. I work at FM MetroCog, and I live in Washington neighborhood. And one of my concerns is Washington doesn't have a formal association, and so I'm grateful that it's included in this plan and RFP, and I think it will be important to balance certain voices and different neighborhoods. And I see this plan as being an opportunity to pull from a toolbox based on a neighborhood's wants and needs versus, you know, a certain neighborhood maybe having more active residents that may steer it in their direction, which may not be a good fit for other neighborhoods. And I think that's important to keep that toolbox approach in mind, where it's not a plan that is applicable to every single neighborhood we have as far as core neighborhoods go. And on that note, I am curious on the how this impacts roadways and the correlation between what MetroCog is working on as well as land use. And then I will say that I'm also interested in how this impacts the idea of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, to a conversation about YIMBYism and how we can embrace change and development, but do it responsibly. I think that's it for me, so.
Well, one other thing I'd like to mention is Carol Pearson had talked about the possibility of hiring an employee to work with the neighborhoods. One of the things that I really like to see is neighborhood associations in all the neighborhoods, and that would be something that is a big project in itself, but it's something that's really necessary for representation from all the neighborhoods. I'm really hoping that we'll be able to find the funds somehow to hire someone that can work specifically with the neighborhoods and actually work to energize them and organize them, get them started anyway. I think Washington, we've had several representatives from Washington who have come to our neighborhood coalition meetings, but because they don't have a neighborhood association, nothing seems to stick. You know, and it's the same with Madison and Unicorn. We've had several people who have shown interest and attended, but then not appear again, primarily because they don't have a neighborhood association.
I was just going back to the beginning, and as we identified the goals, and then I was listening to Nicole talk about the need for land use plans for all of these core neighborhoods. And so I'm really still a little unclear if that's an objective or just a want, but I think at the beginning here we should identify if there will be land use plans prepared for each neighborhood, as well as impacts into existing land use plans. And I guess I'd like to hear what that is. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe a quick answer to that is, yes, absolutely, land use. The idea is, we call this, in planning technical terms, we call this a comprehensive plan. So a comprehensive plan is all things livability, all things housing, all things quality of life. And so just like you don't see project outcomes talking about transportation or land use or zoning, in our world, to maybe just unpack that a little bit, comprehensive planning is all the word, what's the interdisciplinary that Joe was talking about? Interdisciplinary is what makes a complete plan. And so that would be our goal. I don't know, Mark looks like he's got something to say.
Yeah, to add to that, I guess I'm a little concerned, that we're starting to identify topics that have to be addressed by the consultant. I'm kind of hoping that this process of going through the RFP to find a consultant, the consultant would go through some sort of consolidation of everyone's thoughts to be able to put, proposals together for us to review and to approve. And maybe there is a different technique out there when it comes to existing neighborhoods and land use plans that are utilized somewhere, or some other new process. Obviously, we've talked about the land use component on the core neighborhood plans. I'm assuming that probably will be one component, but I think it's a good idea for the consultant to be able to meet with all the groups and be able to propose that as a component as we work through this process of creating the consolidated plan.
Yeah, maybe just as, to piggyback on that, I'll just use the downtown plan as an example, and one of the recommendations as part of the downtown plan included a drop-in center or a day center for homelessness or people needing shelter. And never in a million years, I'm just talking as a planner, never in a million years was that even in my wheelhouse. I experienced it. I knew the people that work at Gladys Ray. I know the issues in downtown, but never had I, been able to take enough time to contemplate that as a solution. It was the consultants interviewing all the stakeholders, including a focus group with homeless people, and where that discovery was made and that recommendation came forward. Same with arts and culture and other topics. So that's what I mean by comprehensive. We don't know what the future holds without the process. And so for us as planners, the most important thing that, the commissioners know this from time to time for me, the most important thing for us as planners in our discipline is process. If the process is good and works, then the outcome is good. And so we have to be very protective of that process, and then we will know the outcome. So that's therein why we had the meeting today, and to have that input and process, so everybody feels welcome to provide their feedback. And then again, we want to make this as transparent as possible, and so we'll keep you more posted, and feel free to reach out to any of us anytime.
Okay. With that, any last comments? Great. Thanks for coming, everybody. Have a great day.